Mafia person who had more to do with being able to prevent 9/11, but that's for a little bit later. But at any rate, with all of this information and seeing the consequences, I felt I had to do something. And I think I should have my head examined for feeling that. But nevertheless, what I did, since I was experiencing cover-ups everywhere, I figured, well, there's a federal crime reporting statute. That says if you know of a federal crime, you got to report it to a federal judge or any other federal official. So I figured, well, okay, I'll file a federal action, which I did, a number of them. And that turned out kind of interesting, especially the one I filed just before 9/11, and even more interesting, the two that I filed after 9/11. But anyhow, there's a tremendous amount of information, and I can't understand so much corruption that exists and the total cover-up by the media. And the people are suffering, just like I go into details on how we generated the hatred in the Middle East. And then I go into the corruption that enabled a series of terrorist attacks to occur. And this is factual. I try to avoid any conspiracy deals.
You just go with what's admitted, which is an incredible amount. Well, let's talk about the particular books and articles where you break down what happened with 9/11 from your perspective and research, your angle, and then leading that into the larger issue of the Middle East and where it's all going.
Okay. Can I give you an introduction on how it could have been prevented? Well, first of all, the CIA had a role in that, but that wasn't not a more criminal role. Complicity was involved in that, and that is with the Department of Justice. I happen to have about a 10-year continual communication with a mole in the Al-Qaeda cell. He was a mole in the cell headed by Ramzi Youssef. And being a former New York City Mafia member, Youssef thought he also wanted to undermine the United States. So Youssef started giving him quite a bit of information on Al-Qaeda activities, including information on several planned Al-Qaeda attacks that did occur. And
are you talking about Ahmad Salam?
I'm talking about Gregory Scarpa Jr., whose father was Mafia Capo, and his father and FBI agents in the New York City offices were involved in murders, just as was occurring in Boston. And Boston had a little more publicity. The murders in the New York City offices were pretty well kept quiet by the media. But anyhow, the mole and his New York City attorney was advising FBI agents of the planned attack as he was receiving the information. Well, Washington deep sixed the information, and the reason they did that, they were planning to discredit this young mafia individual who was planned to testify in several murder trials about the murders that his father committed with the help of specific people in the FBI office.
So he was going to expose something like the Whitey Bulger situation but going on in New York.
That is correct. Since the Department of Justice was planning to discredit the sworn testimony he was given, now they're confronted with the same fellow providing insider information. So apparently they decided to cover up. So the advance information they were having, that they were receiving, was one, the planned bombing or the planned taking down of a airliner departing New York City. The basis for that, they thought, this is what Ramzi Youssef thought, was it would bring about a mistrial. He was undergoing trial for the World Trade Center bombing and the plan of a dozen U.S. airliners in the Middle East. So anyhow, that was the first test. Then the next information, that TWA 800 happened several weeks thereafter. And the next one was the planned bombing of U.S. embassies, and that was covered up. And then, of course, 9/11. So 9/11 then occurred. Now, I go into great details about the 9/11, and I go into how easy it would have been to prevent it. The primary reason for preventing it, for the terrorists being able to get on the aircraft, or the flight attendants had keys. It was obvious to any street thug that all they had to do was get the key from a mostly female flight attendant. They could go in the cockpit and confront the crews. But then the Department of Justice, now that was criminal. So what I did, and after that happened, I filed a federal lawsuit. First, I filed it in federal courts in Washington, D.C., and this is on the basis of the federal crime reporting statute. And they refused to file it, and when they had a mandatory duty to do so. So then I submitted it for filing in New York City, and Judge Michael McCasey, he refused to file it. It wasn't until about a year later when I notified every member of the Supreme Court justices of the latest obstruction of justice by federal judges that then my action was filed. And then within a few minutes, they dismissed it. So they didn't want this information to get out. Now, if you want to go into more details than anywhere, but that's the information I have, actually, that portion of it. In my books, of course, I go into it.
Absolutely. Bottom line, what do you think really happened on 9/11? I mean, we know there was a stand down. We know Saudi Arabia was bare minimum involved. Obviously, I've shown evidence that goes further, but we just go with what we can prove. Now the cover-up has been admitted. They admit the 28 pages. This whole thing should be reopened now when you've got the former head of the commission saying there was a cover-up.
Oh, well, now, incidentally, the 9/11 Commission was pretty well controlled by the same Department of Justice people who were involved in the deep sixing, and I go into quite a bit of details on that, both on the internet site and in books. Now, the areas you talk about, I have no information on that, so I avoid that.
Sure, I understand. Let me raise this. What about the airline that went down right after 9/11? We'll put it on screen for TV viewers. American Airlines Flight 587 that so many witnesses said looked like it had its engine blown off as it took off there from JFK. Do you have any intel on that Airbus 300 situation?
Well, yes, both on the internet site and in my books, I go into that quite a bit. And that was the usual cover-up whereby the NTSB said there was light turbulence when the plane took off, so the tail ripped off. Tails don't rip off that easily. But what I have the statements made by numerous people on the ground. These are professionals, firemen or policemen who report seeing an explosion in the area of the rear baggage compartment. So what happened on that plane, of course, it took off from JFK, and shortly thereafter, it goes down. The explosion occurs one or two engines rip off, and the tail rips off.
Well, that's what I was about to say. I remember at the time, it was even in local papers with cops and firemen and citizens saying the plane just blew up, pieces going everywhere in the sky, thousands of feet in the air after takeoff, and then they spin it and go, that's a conspiracy theory. The back tail just fell off. Clearly, this was a secondary terrorist attack, in my view.
Oh, yes, and I agree with that, and I would presume the system did not want to be reflected as having another terrorist attack occur. It would, of course, reflect badly on the system. And the same thing, if the information that I and all of my sources, and we're all professionals, if this was known, the scandal would go far beyond 9/11. Because this, matter of fact, I'll briefly make reference to the fact that I sued a number of the federal judges because of their cover-up, years of cover-up.
Sure. Well, listen, this is what it comes down to, my friend. Let me give out your website for folks, because I'm going to come back and hit a few final calls. WikiLeaksUSA.org. Rodney Stitch. I want to prepare a bunch of specific questions for you, send them to you ahead of time, because you're an amazing brain, and have you on for a full hour on the Nightly News as part of a special report in the next few weeks. Your books and more can be found at WikiLeaksUSA.org. But just like they claim the tail fell off, never happened before, or the buildings fell, from fire, physics were suspended in and around 9/11. This one thing is for certain: we do not live in boring times. We live in interesting times. To requote the Chinese proverb, China is such a bubble, they are creating a new billionaire every week. But a billionaire in this inflationary currency situation is not a billionaire. Just like somebody worth $1 million in the 30s would be $1 billion today in the aggregate, it is a very strange system that we live in. I mean, soon a 5-bedroom house pretty much anywhere in the country will be, millions of dollars. Well, what if you got 5, 6 kids? I mean, it's just... But the wages aren't going up, but the cost is going up. So California, L.A. passes a $15 an hour minimum wage. That'll just cause more inflation. But I'm digressing. Let's go to your calls. Chris in South Carolina, thanks for holding. You want to talk about H.R. 112, Bill. Tell us about that.
Well, it's something I discovered just by doing a little bit of research, and Alabama's the one that's pushing it. But it's supposed to allow them to put limits on the fiscal spending of federal government, allow them to put, what does it say?
Well, that's great. What's your point on the bill specifically?
I believe they were saying it needed 13 other states, and I noticed that they weren't getting that much view on it, and I was just wondering, do you think it's something that people should support or not?
Are you talking about a constitutional convention?
They were trying to go that direction and then decided against it or something, more or less to basically try to limit the federal government within their state from how long they could actually serve a term.
Sure. I'm familiar with that. I've seen that before. Look, these cons are very, very dangerous because anytime you get one, then it opens it up for anything to be done. At the same time, my view on those is softened a little bit because the feds are so gone that almost anything would be better because they're just doing it all by fiat. But we do need to hold Congress accountable, hold the executive accountable, hold the judiciary as well. And the question is, how do you do that when they're acting in unison with a rogue plan to bring us into a planetary government? I appreciate your call, Chris. Richie in New York, thanks for holding. Go ahead.
Okay, Alex, maybe that goes on to what I want to ask you. How about they sue for everything? Why can't we do the same thing? You know what I'm saying? You have UBC. They dealing with the Business with the Enemy Act in 1944. You know what I'm saying? You have.
That's a great point. A lot of these multinational corporations that are based here trade with all of our enemies. And if they catch a U.S. citizen giving to a charity that gives money to some terror group, you go to jail. Why don't these big corporations get in trouble? Again, the cops are trained, the bureaucracies are trained to only go after little guys.
Way to create a citizens oversight committees on everything they do. I mean, harass them on everything they do. You know, we don't want, you know, listen, how far can we go by petition as opposed to having it try and be a law by representatives? I'm saying we